The alarms had stopped screaming an hour ago, not because the danger had passed, but because every alarm on the moon of Halvet had already said everything it needed to say. Now there was only silence, and the low hum of failing lights. My name is Veskilarian, and I was the last defense officer of the Kalith colony on Halvet. I stood in the command bunker with 12 of my remaining soldiers, and none of us expected to see another sunrise. 3 years earlier, the Skarn swarm had found our star system. They were not a nation. They were not an army with a flag or a cause. They were a hunger that moved through space, consuming every world it touched, turning living things into fuel for more of itself. We had fought them across 4 colonies. We had lost all 4. Halvet was the last one. Behind us was nothing but empty dark and a homeworld that could not be reached in time. In front of us was a fleet so large that our scanners could not count all of it. My commander, an older Kalith named Doran Vache, had told me the truth 3 days ago, when the outer stations went silent one by one. "We are not fighting to win anymore, Vesk," he had said. "We are fighting so our people remember that we stood." I understood him. My species had always been alone in this part of space. We had sent signals outward for 200 years, hoping some other mind out there would answer. Nothing ever had. So when the swarm came, we faced it the way we faced everything, by ourselves. I checked my weapon for the 10th time that night, though I already knew every plate and wire of it. My hands were shaking, but not from fear alone. My daughter, Mira, was 3 levels below me in the shelter caves with the other children. I had said goodbye to her that morning. I had told her that whatever happened, she should remember the sound of my voice, because voices last longer than bodies do. She had asked me if I was scared. I told her the truth. I told her that fear was only proof that something mattered enough to be afraid of losing it. Now, standing in the bunker, watching the tactical display fill with red markers that represented ships larger than our entire capital city, I understood my own words in a way I had not fully felt before. Everything mattered, and it was all about to end. Doran stood beside me, his 4 eyes fixed on the display. He was calm in the way that only someone who had already accepted death could be calm. "The outer shield will fail within the hour," he said. "When it does, they will land troops in the lower valley. We hold the ridge as long as we can. That is all we can offer them." "Understood," I said, though there was nothing to understand. There was only the shape of what was coming. One of my soldiers, a young Kalith named Soren, turned to me. He was barely past his training years. His hands gripped his rifle so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. "Officer Vesk," he said quietly, "do you think anyone will remember us?" I did not have a comforting answer. I only had an honest one. "I don't know, Soren. But I know that we will remember each other, for as long as there is a we left to remember anything." He nodded and said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. The ridge above Halvet's lower valley had been our home for 11 generations. I had grown up on this ground. I had learned to walk on the same stone paths that my soldiers now stood upon, weapons raised, waiting for the sky to open. I thought of my mother, long gone before the swarm ever arrived, and I was glad she was not alive to see this. I thought of my mate, lost in the fall of our 3rd colony, and I told myself that soon I would see her again, in whatever place waited after all of this. I was not religious by nature, but on that ridge, in that hour, I allowed myself to believe in something gentler than the dark. The shield alarm changed tone, a long falling note that every soldier on Halvet had learned to recognize during the siege. It meant collapse was near. Doran's voice came over the comm to every remaining post on the moon. "This is Commander Vash. The outer shield will fail in 20 minutes. All units, hold your positions. We do not retreat. We do not surrender. We stand, so that when this is finished, whatever remains of our people will know their defenders did not run." There was no cheering. There was no display of courage for its own sake. There was only quiet acceptance among soldiers who had made peace with their fate days ago. I walked along the ridgeline, checking each position, saying a few words to soldiers I had commanded for years. Some of them I had trained myself. Some of them had children in the same shelter caves as Mira. We did not speak of hope, we spoke of small things. A soldier named Talon asked me if I remembered the harvest festival from before the war. I told him I did. He smiled, just slightly, and said that was a good thing to remember before the end. 20 minutes passed like 20 years. The sky above Halvet, usually a soft violet color from our thin atmosphere, began to shimmer and crack, as if something enormous were pressing against a pane of glass from the other side. The outer shield, built by 3 generations of Calith engineers, had held against the swarm for 104 days. Now it broke apart in complete silence, the same silence that had followed every disaster since this war began. Sensors lit up instantly. Descent trails, hundreds of them, streaking down from the fleet above, aimed directly at the valley below our ridge. Positions, I called, though everyone was already in position. There was nowhere else to be. I raised my weapon and looked out over the valley, watching the first trails of swarm dropcraft burn through what remained of our atmosphere. I felt something strange settle over me in that moment. Not courage exactly, something closer to stillness. The stillness of an ending finally arriving after being expected for so long. Doran stood a few meters from me, his weapon raised, his 4 eyes steady on the falling lights. "It has been an honor, Vesk," he said, not looking away from the sky. "It has been an honor, Commander," I answered. I thought of Mira, 3 levels below, and I hoped that whatever happened to me on this ridge, she would live long enough to remember my voice. The first swarm dropcraft struck the valley floor, and dark shapes began pouring out of it, moving with the horrible, wrong efficiency that had ended 4 Calith colonies before this one. My soldiers opened fire. I opened fire. We held the ridge exactly as long as we had promised to, no longer and no shorter, because that was all any of us had left to give. And then, in the middle of the chaos, in the middle of the falling light and the screaming machines and the last stand of everything my people had ever built, the sky above the valley tore open in a way I had never seen before. It was not swarm light. It was not the pale violet burn of our own aircraft. It was something new, something searing white and impossibly fast, streaking down through the dark, like a blade being drawn across the heavens. For one terrible second, I thought the swarm had brought something worse. I did not yet understand that the sky was not falling apart. It was opening for something else entirely. Something that none of us, in all our years of preparing to die alone, had ever thought to expect. The white streaks did not slow as they entered the valley. They struck the ground like falling stars, and where they landed, the earth threw up columns of dust and fire. My first thought was pure instinct, the same instinct that had kept me alive through 4 years of war. New hostiles. I shouted, dropping low behind the ridgestone. "Brace for impact." My soldiers scattered into cover, weapons raised toward the smoking craters below. I had seen every kind of swarm landing craft in existence. I had studied their approach patterns until I could recognize them in my sleep. This was nothing like that. The shapes falling from the sky were smaller, faster, and they moved with a violent precision that did not match anything in our intelligence records. For a moment, I believed we were about to die even faster than we had planned for. Then the craters opened, and figures began climbing out of them. They were not swarm. I knew that immediately, in the same way you know the shape of a threat before your mind finishes explaining why. Swarm units moved as one mass, connected, mindless, terrifying in their unity. These figures moved as individuals. They shouted to each other. They took cover behind rocks, the way a person takes cover, not the way a machine calculates an angle. They were tall, upright, 2 arms, 2 legs, a shape that was somehow both completely foreign and unsettlingly familiar. Heavy armor covered most of their bodies, but I could see enough to understand that whatever these creatures were, they were alive in the way my own people were alive. "Hold fire," I ordered, though every instinct in my body told me to do the opposite. Identify before engaging. One of the new soldiers turned toward the ridge. Even from that distance, I could see something in the way it moved its head, a kind of alertness, a kind of awareness that felt disturbingly close to intelligence I recognized. It raised an arm toward us, not a weapon, just an open hand. Then the swarm units in the valley reacted. They had been advancing toward our ridge in their usual formation, an endless tide of dark shapes moving without hesitation or fear. Now they turned, redirecting their entire advance toward the newly landed figures instead. In an instant, the valley became a storm of fire and motion, and the strangers who had fallen from the sky were now the primary target of an enemy that had ignored everything except my people for 4 years. I watched, frozen for half a second, as the first true clash began. It did not look like anything I had studied about warfare. The swarm attacked in overwhelming numbers, the same way they always did, relying on sheer mass to break through any resistance. The strangers below did not break. They moved in small groups, covering each other, falling back and advancing in patterns that seemed almost rehearsed, though I would later learn they were reacting in real time to a threat they had never faced before. One of them, a soldier with short dark hair visible beneath a cracked helmet, threw something small into a cluster of advancing swarm units. The resulting explosion tore through a dozen of them at once, throwing broken machine parts into the air. I had never seen a single handheld device cause that much destruction. My own military used heavy artillery to achieve similar results, and even then, not always successfully. "What are they?" Soren asked beside me, his voice caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. "I don't know," I admitted, "but watch how they fight." We watched. The strangers did not fight like soldiers who expected to survive the encounter, and yet they also did not fight like soldiers who expected to die. There was a strange confidence in their movements, a kind of controlled fury that seemed to say this outcome was neither surrender nor sacrifice, but simply the beginning of a fight they intended to win. A swarm unit broke through the strangers' defensive line and moved directly toward one of the smaller figures, a soldier who had been reloading a weapon and had not yet noticed the threat. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, though I knew my voice would never carry that distance. Before I could make a sound, another stranger moved between the swarm unit and the unaware soldier, taking the full force of its attack directly. The soldier fell backward, armor sparking, but was already rolling to the side and firing upward before the swarm unit could press its advantage. 2 more strangers converged instantly, and within seconds the threat was eliminated. I had commanded soldiers for over a decade. I had trained them, disciplined them, buried too many of them. I understood coordination. I understood loyalty between soldiers who had fought together for years and had learned to protect each other through long habit. What I was watching below was something else. These strangers had clearly never fought beside each other in this exact configuration before, and yet they moved to protect one another as if the habit had been built into them long before this battle ever began. "Commander," I said into the comm, still watching the chaos unfold in the valley, "we have unknown combatants engaging the swarm directly. They are not attacking our positions." Doran's voice came back immediately, tight with the same disbelief I felt. "Confirmed. Hold position and observe. Do not engage unless directly threatened." For the first time in 4 years, I watched swarm forces suffer real losses, not the small, temporary setbacks we had occasionally managed to inflict during desperate stands, but genuine, significant destruction. The strangers below fought with weapons that tore through swarm armor as if it were nothing more than thin metal sheeting. They fought with a ferocity that seemed impossible for creatures who, judging by their numbers, had only just arrived. One stranger, larger than the others, stood in an exposed position and fired continuously into an advancing wave of swarm units, buying time for 2 smaller figures to drag a wounded comrade back toward cover. Swarm fire struck the ground around him repeatedly, and still he did not move from his position until the wounded soldier and those helping him were safely behind a rock formation. I felt something strange rise in my chest as I watched this. It was not quite hope. Hope had been burned out of me over 4 years of loss. It was something closer to disbelief, the kind that comes when you witness something your mind insists should not be possible. The valley continued to burn. Swarm numbers, which had seemed endless only an hour before, began to visibly thin. The strangers below took losses too. I watched several of them fall and not rise again, and something in me ached at the sight, even though I did not yet know who or what they were. A soldier near the center of their formation, a woman by the shape and voice carried faintly on the wind, shouted something I could not fully understand at that distance. Whatever it was, the strangers around her responded immediately, shifting formation, concentrating their fire on a specific section of the swarm line. Moments later, that section collapsed entirely, and a path opened through what had, until then, seemed like an unbreakable wall of enemy forces. "Vesk," Soren said quietly, "should we help them?" I looked at my soldiers, all of whom were watching the same impossible scene unfold below. I looked at the strangers fighting an enemy that had already destroyed everything my people had built across 4 worlds. I thought of Mira, 3 levels below the ridge, and I thought of every soldier I had lost, trying to buy time for people who would likely never live to see the peace that time was meant to purchase. I made a decision that, until that moment, I had never expected to have the chance to make. "Yes," I said, "prepare to move down the ridge, we fight with them." My soldiers looked at me with a mixture of fear and something else, something I had not seen in their eyes for a very long time. It might have been the beginning of hope, though none of us would have called it that yet. We moved down the ridge as a unit, weapons ready, uncertain if the strangers below would see us as allies or additional threats. As we descended, one of them turned toward our approach, weapon raised instinctively, before lowering slightly, as he seemed to recognize that we were not moving like swarm units. He was tall, with short brown hair damp beneath a cracked helmet, and there was a long mark across one side of his face where something had struck his armor hard enough to leave a mark on the skin beneath. His eyes, when they met mine, held none of the mindless aggression the swarm units displayed. They held focus, and something close to recognition, as though he understood immediately what kind of creature I was and what side of this fight I belonged on. "Friendly," I shouted, raising a hand the way I had seen him do earlier. I did not know if the gesture meant the same thing to his kind as it did to mine, but it was the only universal signal I could think to offer. He studied me for half a second, an eternity in the middle of a battlefield, then nodded once and turned back toward the enemy. "Then get down and start shooting," he called back, his voice carrying clearly, despite the chaos around us. We could use the help. There was no time for questions, no time for introductions, no time to understand what these creatures were, or where they had come from, or why they had fallen from the sky at the exact moment my people had finished preparing to die. There was only the fight in front of us, and for the first time in 4 years, my people were not fighting it alone. I raised my weapon, moved into position beside the stranger, and opened fire alongside him. Whatever these creatures were, in that moment, they were the first allies my species had ever known. We fought together through the rest of that night, and by the time the last swarm unit in the valley fell silent, the sky above Halvit had begun to lighten with the pale gray of early morning. I had not expected to see another sunrise. Now I stood among smoking wreckage and fallen bodies, both Caliph and stranger, breathing air that tasted like fire and dust, alive in a way I had stopped believing was possible. The soldier with the brown hair and the mark across his face found me sitting on a broken piece of swarm armor, catching my breath for the first time in hours. He walked over slowly, favoring one leg slightly, and sat down on a nearby rock without asking permission, as though we had known each other for years instead of one long, brutal night. "Daniel," he said, tapping his chest. "That's my name." I understood the gesture even without knowing his language beyond the few words our translation devices had begun to piece together during the fighting. "Vesk," I said, doing the same. He nodded, looking out over the valley at the wreckage scattered across it. "That's a lot of dead machines," he said quietly. "You've been fighting these things a while?" 4 years, I answered, my translator working to convert my words into something close to his language. "You arrived at the exact moment we had prepared to lose everything." Daniel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, His voice had lost some of its battlefield sharpness, replaced by something more tired, more human, though I did not yet have that word for what I was sensing. "We picked up a distress signal a while back," he said. "Real old one. Took our people time to figure out where it came from and get resources out this far. I'm sorry it took so long." I stared at him, trying to understand what he had just told me. "You came because of a signal we sent 200 years ago." "Looks like it," he said. "By the time it reached anyone who could actually do something about it, well, it took a while to organize a response. Space is big. Answers don't come fast." I thought of the countless nights my people had spent sending messages into the dark, hoping some other mind out there would hear us and care enough to answer. I had grown up believing those signals were lost forever, swallowed by the endless silence between stars. I had never imagined that somewhere, at some point in that impossible distance, someone had actually heard us and had chosen, centuries later, to come. "Why?" I asked. "Why come this far, knowing what you might find, knowing you might be facing something you had never encountered before?" Daniel looked at me as though the question itself was strange to him. "Because you asked for help," he said simply. "That's kind of the whole point." I did not have an answer for that. My species had learned, through hard experience, that the universe did not often reward such simple reasoning. Help was not something given freely. It was earned, traded, or taken. The idea that an entire fleet of soldiers would cross an unimaginable distance simply because someone, somewhere, had once asked for help was a concept that sat uneasily in my mind, refusing to settle into anything I recognized as familiar. Over the following days, as more human ships descended to establish a proper foothold on Halvet, I began to understand these creatures a little better, though understanding did not always mean comfort. They were strange in ways I had not expected. They laughed in the middle of danger, a kind of dark humor that seemed to help them process the horror around them rather than ignore it. They argued loudly among themselves about small, meaningless things, then moved instantly into perfect coordination the moment real danger appeared. I met a woman named Grace, who had been the one shouting commands during the battle in the valley. She was shorter than Daniel, with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority without needing volume to enforce it. She was the commanding officer of the human unit that had landed on Halvet, and within a day of meeting her, I understood why her soldiers followed her without hesitation. "Your commander wants to talk logistics," she told me on the second day as we walked through the ruins of the outer defense line together. "Supply routes, medical support, that sort of thing. But I wanted to ask you something first." "Ask," I said. "Your people held this ridge for 4 years against those things," she said, gesturing toward the wreckage still being cleared from the valley below. "No outside help, no reinforcements, nothing but yourselves. That takes something most people don't have." I considered her words carefully. "We did not hold because we were strong," I said. "We held because we had nowhere else to go, and because giving up was worse than dying." Grace nodded slowly, as though she understood that distinction better than most creatures could. "Where we come from," she said, "we call that courage anyway. Doesn't matter what feeling was underneath it. What matters is you didn't run." I found myself studying her more closely after that conversation. There was something in the way humans spoke about fear and struggle that did not match anything in my own culture's understanding of these concepts. My people viewed fear as something to be endured privately, a weakness to be hidden from others, even while it consumed you from within. Humans, it seemed, spoke of fear openly, almost casually, as though acknowledging it took away some of its power rather than adding to it. On the third day, I watched a young human soldier named Peter, barely older than Soren by the look of him, break down in quiet tears near the edge of the medical tents after losing a friend in the earlier fighting. I expected the other soldiers around him to look away, to give him privacy for what I assumed would be considered shameful weakness. Instead, 2 other soldiers sat down beside him without a word, one placing a hand on his shoulder, the other simply staying close until he had finished. No one mocked him, no one suggested he should hide his grief. When he finally stood and wiped his face, the same soldiers helped him back to his feet and walked with him back toward the others, as though nothing shameful had happened at all. I mentioned this to Daniel later that evening, as we sat together near one of the human supply depots, sharing a strange, dense food item he called a ration bar, which tasted nothing like anything from my own world, but was somehow satisfying regardless. "We don't really see crying as weak," Daniel explained, when I asked him about what I had witnessed. "Losing someone hurts. Pretending it doesn't just means it eats at you later, usually at the worst possible time. Better to let it out when you can, with people who understand." "On my world," I said slowly, "showing such feelings in front of soldiers is considered a failure of discipline." Daniel considered this for a moment. "I get why some people might think that," he said, "but in my experience, the soldiers who let themselves feel things and still get back up and keep fighting, they're usually the strongest ones in the long run. The ones who bottle everything up tend to break eventually. Just takes longer to see it happen." I did not fully agree with him, not at first, but I found myself unable to dismiss his reasoning either. Over the following days, I watched countless small moments that reinforced what he had said. Humans argued, laughed, grieved, and fought with an emotional openness that unsettled me at first, and yet somehow, beneath all that apparent chaos, they were remarkably steady in the moments that truly mattered. On the 5th day after their arrival, swarm forces launched a renewed assault against the eastern perimeter of Halvet, testing the newly established human defenses. I was present when the attack began, standing alongside a mixed unit of Caliph and human soldiers who had, in less than a week, developed a working rhythm of cooperation that should have taken months to build. During the fighting, a swarm strike collapsed part of a supply bunker, trapping 3 Caliph engineers beneath heavy debris. I heard the call for help over the comm and immediately began moving toward the site, though I knew the fighting around it made a rescue attempt extremely dangerous. Before I arrived, I saw a human soldier named Henry, already tearing at the debris with his bare hands, ignoring the swarm fire still striking the area around him. Another soldier, a woman named Laura, was providing covering fire while shouting instructions to the trapped engineers, trying to keep them calm while Henry worked to free them. I reached the site and immediately joined the effort, pulling debris aside alongside Henry, while Laura continued holding back the advancing swarm units with a level of precision that reminded me of Grace's earlier coordination during the Valley battle. Within minutes, we had freed all 3 engineers, though Henry had taken a significant injury to his arm during the rescue, a wound he did not mention or acknowledge until the engineers were fully clear of the wreckage. "You're hurt," I said, noticing blood soaking through the sleeve of his uniform. "It'll keep," he said simply, already turning back toward the fighting. "They're safe first, that's what matters." I stood there for a moment, watching him move back into position despite his injury, and I felt something shift inside me that I had not expected to feel again after everything my people had endured. It was not quite hope, not yet, but it was something close to it, something that had begun growing quietly since the moment these strangers had fallen from the sky and chosen to fight beside us instead of simply passing us by. For the first time in 4 years, I began to believe that my people might survive this war after all. 2 weeks after the humans arrived, everything about the war on Halvet had changed. The swarm, which had once seemed like an unstoppable force capable of consuming entire worlds without pause, was now being pushed back from territory it had already claimed. I watched this shift happen gradually, then suddenly, the way a long, slow illness can seem stable for a long time before finally breaking in one direction or the other. Grace and Doran had spent long hours together, planning what the humans called a coordinated offensive, something my own people had never attempted, since we had never possessed the resources or numbers to consider retaking lost ground. The idea itself felt strange to me at first. For 4 years, every decision my people made had been about survival, about how long we could delay the inevitable. The humans spoke about the war differently. They spoke about ending it. "You don't just want to survive this," I said to Daniel one evening as we prepared for what would become the largest engagement since the humans' arrival. "You want to win it. That's usually the goal," he said, checking the components of his weapon with practiced hands. No offense, but surviving one more day isn't much of a plan long term. I did not take offense. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that my people had stopped believing victory was possible so long ago that we had forgotten how to plan for it. The humans had not carried that same exhaustion with them. They had arrived believing this fight could actually be won, and somehow, that belief alone had begun to change the shape of the war itself. The offensive began at first light, targeting a major swarm production facility that had been steadily generating new units throughout the siege, the same facility responsible for the endless waves that had eventually broken my people's defenses on 3 previous colonies. Destroying it would not end the war, but it would deal a significant blow to the swarm's ability to sustain its assault on Halvet. I fought alongside Daniel's unit that day, moving through terrain that had once been farmland before the war turned it into scorched, broken ground. The fighting was fierce from the very beginning, the swarm defending the facility with a concentration of forces greater than anything I had witnessed since the initial invasion of Halvet. We advanced in careful stages, human and Calith soldiers moving together in patterns that had become familiar over the past 2 weeks, though the danger never lessened no matter how practiced we became. I watched Grace direct the overall assault from a forward command position, her voice steady over the comm even as reports of casualties began coming in from multiple directions. By midday, we had pushed close enough to the facility to begin the final assault, though swarm resistance had grown increasingly desperate, throwing everything it had left into defending what remained of its production capability. It was during this final push that everything changed for me in a way I had not expected. A large group of swarm units broke through a section of our advancing line, cutting off a small squad that included Soren among its members. I heard his voice over the comm, tight with controlled fear, reporting that his group was surrounded and running low on resources to hold their position. I began moving toward his location immediately, though the distance and the fighting between us made a quick rescue impossible. Daniel, running beside me, recognized the situation just as fast as I had. "That's your soldier," he said. "The young one, right? The one who asked if anyone would remember you all." "Yes," I said, my chest tight with a fear I had not felt this sharply since the first night of the human arrival. "We need to reach him." Daniel did not hesitate. He redirected our small group towards Soren's position, calling for additional support over the comm while moving faster than I thought his heavy armor should have allowed. We fought our way through swarm resistance for what felt like an impossibly long stretch of time, though it likely lasted only minutes. When we finally broke through to Soren's position, we found his squad pinned against a collapsed wall, ammunition nearly exhausted, swarm units closing in from 2 directions at once. Soren himself had taken an injury to his leg and was struggling to remain standing, though he continued firing to cover the retreat of 2 younger Calith soldiers beside him. Daniel moved immediately to provide covering fire, allowing me to reach Soren and begin pulling him back toward safer ground. It was in that moment, as I struggled to support Soren's weight while swarm fire continued striking the area around us, that I saw a group of swarm units shift their focus entirely toward Daniel, who had positioned himself directly between them and the rest of us. "Daniel!" I shouted, unable to do anything more as I continued moving Soren toward cover. "Fall back." He did not fall back. Instead, he held his position, absorbing the concentrated attention of the advancing swarm units, buying enough time for the rest of us to reach safety behind a ridge of broken stone. I turned in time to see him finally begin retreating, moving backward while still firing, until a swarm strike caught him directly, throwing him hard against the ground. I left Soren with the others and moved toward Daniel immediately, my mind refusing to process what I had just witnessed. By the time I reached him, Laura and another soldier had already arrived, pulling him behind cover while calling urgently for medical support. His armor had been badly damaged across his chest and side, and blood was visible beneath the cracked plating. He was conscious, though clearly in significant pain, his breathing shallow and uneven. "You shouldn't have done that," I said, kneeling beside him, my voice unsteady in a way I had not expected. "You did not need to protect my soldiers. You did not owe them anything." Daniel looked up at me, his expression somehow calm despite the pain he was clearly experiencing. "Didn't need a reason," he said quietly. "He's young, scared, trying his best anyway. That's worth protecting, whether I know him or not." Medical support arrived within minutes, and Daniel was quickly stabilized enough for transport back to the human medical facility that had been established near the ridge. I stayed with him as long as I was permitted, watching as human medics worked with quiet efficiency to address his injuries, their expressions focused but not panicked, as though this was simply another difficult moment to be managed rather than a crisis to be feared. Later that evening, once the assault on the swarm facility had succeeded and the immediate fighting had ended, I sat outside the medical tent where Daniel was recovering, waiting for permission to see him. Grace found me there, her uniform still marked with the dust and damage of the day's fighting. "He's going to be all right," she said, sitting down beside me without being asked. "Took a bad hit, but our medics caught it in time. He'll be out of action for a while, but he'll recover." I felt something loosen in my chest at her words, a tension I had not fully acknowledged until it began to ease. "He should not have done what he did," I said. "He put himself at severe risk for a soldier who was not even his own." Grace considered this for a moment, watching the last light of the day fade over the ridge. "That's kind of the whole point of why we came all this way," she said. "We didn't come here because your people were ours to protect by obligation. We came because you needed help. And Daniel doesn't see soldiers on this world as anything other than people worth protecting, same as anyone else." "Why?" I asked, the question feeling heavier than it had when I had first asked Daniel something similar weeks earlier. Why risk so much for strangers you had never met before this war began? Grace turned to look at me directly. "Because somewhere out there, a long time ago, someone helped us when we desperately needed it," she said. "We haven't forgotten what that felt like. Seemed only right to pass it forward when we got the chance." I did not fully understand her answer. Not completely, not yet. But I understood enough to know that whatever these creatures were, whatever strange culture had shaped them into soldiers capable of both fierce combat and quiet compassion in the same breath, they had changed something fundamental about how my people understood the universe around us. We had spent 200 years believing we were entirely alone, that no one beyond our own small colonies would ever answer our call for help. Now I sat outside a medical tent, waiting to see a soldier who had nearly given his life defending one of my own people, and I understood, perhaps for the first time since this war began, that being alone had never been the only possibility. It had simply been the only truth we had known, until humanity fell from the sky and proved otherwise. 6 months passed before the swarm fleet finally withdrew from the space surrounding Halvet entirely. It did not happen in a single dramatic moment, the way I had once imagined an ending to this war might look. Instead, it happened gradually, one destroyed production facility at a time, one broken supply line at a time, until the enemy that had haunted my people for 4 years simply no longer had the strength to continue its assault on our world. I stood on the same ridge where I had once prepared to die, looking out over a valley that had been the site of our final stand and, later, the place where humanity had first fallen from the sky to change everything. The wreckage had mostly been cleared by then, though scars remained across the land, deep gouges in the earth that would likely take generations to fully heal. Daniel stood beside me, fully recovered from his injuries, though a long mark remained across his side where the swarm strike had caught him months earlier. He had shown it to me once, without any apparent discomfort, the same casual openness about pain and struggle that I had come to recognize as deeply, distinctly human. "Strange, isn't it?" he said, looking out over the quiet valley below. "Standing here now, after everything." "Strange does not begin to describe it," I said. 6 months ago, I stood on this exact spot, believing I would not live to see another sunrise. Now I stand here again, and the war that was supposed to end my people's existence has ended instead. Below us, both human and Kalith soldiers worked together clearing debris, rebuilding structures, and in some cases, simply sitting together in quiet conversation during rest periods. A scene that would have seemed impossible to me only 6 months earlier. I saw Soren among them, fully recovered from his injury, laughing at something Peter had said, the two of them having become close friends during the months of shared struggle. I saw Grace and Doran standing together near the edge of the valley, discussing what I assumed were plans for the continued rebuilding of Halvet, their easy cooperation a testament to how far both our peoples had come since that first chaotic night of unexpected alliance. Your people prepared for death for 4 years, Daniel said quietly, echoing thoughts I had shared with him many times over the past months. That takes a kind of strength most people never have to find in themselves. We prepared for death because we believed death was the only outcome left to us, I said. We never once considered that somewhere out in that darkness, another people existed who would choose to help us, simply because we asked. Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching the soldiers below continue their work. For what it's worth, he said eventually, I don't think your people were wrong to prepare the way you did. Facing something that big, believing you might lose everything, and still choosing to stand anyway, that's not weakness. That's the kind of courage that earns help, even when you don't know it's coming. I thought about Mira, safe now in the shelter caves that had become permanent housing as Halvet slowly rebuilt itself. I thought about Doran, who had led our people through 4 years of impossible odds, with a steadiness I would never fully be able to match myself. I thought about every soldier who had died on this ridge before humanity ever arrived, soldiers who would never know that their sacrifice had ultimately helped buy enough time for salvation to arrive. I would like to visit your world someday, I said to Daniel, surprising myself slightly with the honesty of the statement. I would like to understand more fully the people who traveled so far to save strangers they had never met. Daniel smiled, an expression I had come to recognize as genuine warmth rather than mere politeness. You'd be welcome there, he said. More than welcome, honestly. After everything your people went through, and everything we went through together here, I think a lot of folks back home would consider you family before they'd consider you strangers. That evening, I gathered with Doran, Grace, Daniel, and several other officers from both our peoples in what had once been our primary command bunker, now repurposed as a shared meeting space for coordinating the ongoing recovery efforts across Halvet. It was during this meeting that Doran raised a subject that had clearly been weighing on him since the swarm's final withdrawal. We owe your people a debt that cannot be easily repaid, he said, addressing Grace directly, though his words seemed meant for every human present. You arrived at the moment of our complete destruction and chose to fight beside us, at great cost to your own soldiers. I do not know how a people rebuilds trust in this universe after 200 years of believing themselves entirely alone, but I know that whatever alliance forms between our worlds going forward, it will be built with deep respect for what your people have given us. Grace considered his words carefully before responding. We didn't come here looking for a debt to be repaid, she said. We came because your signal reached us, and because that's simply what we choose to do when we hear that call. But if you're asking whether we'd want an alliance going forward, speaking honestly, I think both our peoples could learn a great deal from each other. What could we possibly teach a species capable of what your soldiers accomplished here? I asked, unable to fully hide my genuine curiosity. Grace looked at me directly, her expression thoughtful. Your people held this ridge alone for 4 years against something we'd never even encountered before, she said. That kind of endurance, that willingness to keep fighting even when hope seemed completely gone, that's not something every species has in them. We brought firepower and tactics. You brought a kind of stubborn courage that outlasted 4 years of losses most militaries wouldn't survive in 4 months. Seems to me both those things matter equally in a fight like this. I considered her words long after the meeting had ended, walking alone along the ridge under Halvet's quiet night sky, the same sky that had once seemed like nothing but an endless, indifferent dark, and now held new meaning entirely. Somewhere out there, among countless stars my people had once believed held no answer for us, an entire civilization existed that ran toward danger for people they had never met, simply because those people had once asked for help. I thought of the 200 years of silence my people had endured, sending signals into that dark without ever knowing if anyone would answer. I thought of the 4 years of war that had followed, 4 years spent believing our final chapter would be written in isolation, unremembered by anyone beyond ourselves. And I thought of the moment the sky had torn open above our final stand, delivering soldiers who fought like they had nothing to lose and everything to protect. Soldiers who cried openly for fallen friends and still stood again the next morning ready to fight. Soldiers who threw themselves into danger for strangers without asking what they might gain in return. We had prepared for death for 4 long years, certain that no one in this vast, silent universe would ever come to answer our call. Instead, human soldiers had fallen from the sky, and in doing so, had taught my people something far more valuable than survival alone. They had taught us that being alone in the universe had never truly been our fate. It had simply been a truth we had not yet lived long enough to see proven false. Halvet would rebuild. My people would grow stronger, guided by both the hard lessons of 4 years of isolated struggle and the new lessons offered by an alliance none of us could have imagined possible before that first impossible night. And somewhere in the quiet corners of every rebuilt structure across our world, a simple truth would remain, passed down through generations the way only the most important stories are passed down. When my people had faced complete destruction, when every signal we sent had seemed lost to an uncaring universe, humanity had answered anyway, not because they had to, not because it benefited them in any measurable way, simply because somewhere, sometime, we had asked, and that had been reason enough. I stood on that ridge for a long while that night, looking up at the stars that no longer felt empty, and for the first time since this war began, I allowed myself to believe fully in something I had once considered impossible. We were no longer alone, and whatever challenges the future still held for either of our peoples, we would face them together, exactly as we had learned to do on the night the sky opened above Halvet and changed everything.